Hello, I'm Roger Bisbee from the Skill Builder channel, and in this little whiteboard presentation I'd like to talk to you about pressure loss from heating systems and what you can do about it, because a lot of people search how to repressure their central heating, how to top their pressure up, but they don't think about why they're losing it. And if they do think about why they're losing it, sometimes they can't find the reason. And if you don't find the reason, it can be really problematic, because it will lead to rusting of your radiators, premature failure of your boiler, and all kinds of other problems. So if you're losing pressure on a regular basis, and when I say regular basis, I mean if you've got to top up your system more than, say, twice a year, you should be slightly concerned. But if you're doing it on a monthly basis, you should be more concerned. If you're doing it on a weekly basis, you should be very concerned.
You can get a quote on a shiny new boiler online in a few minutes, and we'll beat any like-for-like quote by £50. The Warmzilla package includes a system filter, system cleanse, wireless controls, any flues or extension kits you need, and up to a 12-year guarantee. Get an instant online quote now by answering a few simple questions at warmzilla.co.uk.
So let's try and find out exactly what your problem is if you're losing pressure from your heating system. So let's keep things nice and simple here, shall we? What we've got here is a boiler, and we've got a flow coming out of the boiler, and it's finding its way around a central heating system which has got radiators on it, and the hot water is going up to the radiators. It's losing its heat in the radiators into the rooms, and then it's returning at a slightly lower temperature. It won't be cold like that blue, but it will be colder as it's returning to the boiler and being heated up in the boiler. Now, this is a modern boiler we got here. This is what we call a condensing boiler, high efficiency boiler, which is the kind of boiler that everybody should have these days because it saves you a lot of fuel. And what we have inside this boiler is a pump. And the pump is a very intelligent little pump, and it's working away. It's sensing the amount of resistance that's on the pipework, and it's working away so that it's matching the load, if you like, to the pump speed. Over the course of a few weeks, we noticed that the boiler is stopping working. And we look at a little manual or the instructions on the front, and it says that if your boiler has lost pressure, we've got a little pressure gauge under the flap here at the front, and the pressure gauge looks something like that. And it's got numbers on it. It's got a 0 there, it's got a 1 there, it's got a 2 there, it's got a 3 there, and so on and so on, yeah? So, in an ideal world, there's a 1, there's our little needle on it, and our needle would be somewhere around that 1.5 bar, 1 bar, 1.5 bar. Let's not argue too much about it, but that would be the kind of operating pressure when it's cold. So on the pressure gauge, we've got an operating system somewhere like that. We've got an operating zone, say it's running from about 1 bar, 1.5 bar, around there. So anywhere around there is what we consider to be good as an operating pressure. Over here, we've got our excessive pressure, 3 bar. It's a very important number to remember, because in the boiler, down here somewhere, we've got a pressure relief valve, and that pressure relief valve is connected to a little 15mm pipe which is going out there. And if, for example, we had a wall here, that pipe would go through the wall, and you'd see some kind of little return on it, or some kind of little thing where it kind of sprayed the discharge from that pipe against the wall rather than straight out. And the reason for that is that there'd be hot water coming out of here, and if somebody's walking past there, you don't want them to get a face full of hot water if this boiler suddenly decides it needs to relieve a little bit of its pressure. So that little safety device there, that little way that we turn that pipe round or put some kind of cap on it so that it sprays against the wall. It's very, very useful that it sprays against the wall, because if there's any water coming out of it, we may see a kind of staining or a wet patch on the wall where that water's been coming out. Sometimes we won't, because sometimes it's just dripping out little bit by little bit over the course of a week. Now, why is it doing it? When water heats up, it expands. You probably remember that from your science lessons or from somewhere else. Let's not be patronising. So when that water heats up, it expands and it needs to go somewhere. Now, back in the old days, back in the days before, probably before you were born, we used to have a tank up in the loft, feed an expansion tank, and that would have a little bit of top-up water in it, fed by a ball valve. And then as the water heated up in the system, the excess water, because it expands, the excess water from the system would find its way up into the expansion tank, up that pipe, and the level in the expansion tank would rise, and as the water cooled down, it would fall. Now, we've done away with that to a great extent because we now have boilers on what we call a sealed system rather than an open vented system. So that little tank in the loft and that top up water is no longer there. And what we have instead is a little pipe here, and that is connected with a little hose, a little silver hose, couple of valves on there, and there's an incoming main there. And when we turn those little valves on there, the needle on our pressure gauge will start to rise. So we turn it on and we just wait until it's come up 1 bar, 1.5 bar, somewhere around there, and the boiler will miraculously start working again. A lot of you know that, a lot of you have had to do that on a fairly regular basis. So we've done away with this tank up in the loft. The boiler is now working, the water is expanding, but where is it expanding to? Well, they thought about it. Inside the boiler, tucked away either at the back or at the side, is a big red, flattish looking tank. And that tank is called the expansion vessel. And on top of that tank is a little valve, a sort of valve that you might find on your car tyres or your mountain bike tyres, what we call a Schrader valve. And when you pump that Schrader valve up with a bit of air, with your bike pump or whatever, it will push air into the expansion vessel, and there's a diaphragm inside that expansion vessel, like a rubber membrane if you like, and it will compress that rubber membrane down, and that will give you a cushion of air. Now, it's important when this is done, by the way, if you're topping up the pressure on your expansion vessel, you need to relieve the water on the system somehow. If you've got a drain cock on the system, you need to drain a little bit of water out. You don't have to go crazy, you can put less than half a bucket or something like that of water out of the system, just so that that pressure gauge drops to 0, and then you can pump up that vessel there, and so long as that hasn't gone up, you're still fine. You're not pressuring it against the water. So we want to charge that pressure vessel up when that system has got room to take whatever that is that we're going to put into there. Now, what are we going to put into there? We're going to put into there whatever the static pressure of the system is, the cold static pressure of the system. So if the system's working at something like 1 bar static pressure, or 1.5 bar, as I said, static pressure, we want to top that tank up to about 1.5 bar there, so that when this water is heated up and it expands into our pressure vessel. So we've got that 1.5 bar in the pressure vessel, or maybe we've got 1 bar in there, and it's pushing and expanding against that. We're not going to get hung up on this pressure in the pressure vessel. 1 bar, 1.5 bar, absolutely fine, and it will compress the air in that expansion vessel, and as it does that, you will see as the water warms up, the needle will start to go up towards the red. And if you're lucky, if you've done it right, it's going to end up somewhere around the 2 bar. I'd be quite happy if a system's operating at somewhere around 2 bar. That little needle there is now sitting up here. So long as it's sitting up there, that's fine. Now, if we happen to put a little bit too much water into the system there, if we went over the top and then we heated the boiler up, then it would reach 3 bar, and when it reaches 3 bar, this little pressure relief valve here will open up momentarily because it's on a spring, and it will allow a discharge of water out of that pipe to bring that pressure in the system back down to below 3 bar, so somewhere around there. So that's a fully automatic system. We don't really need to worry about that in any sense, except of course when we're losing pressure. When we've topped this up to about 1.5 bar and we leave it for a week or so and we notice it's gone back down again, we say, where's the water going? So the first place you check is your pressure relief discharge, and just see if there's any water there, and if you have to put something like a little balloon over the end of it or something, just maybe sometimes even hanging a yogurt cup beneath it, just have a check, because you know you can go out there and think, oh no, there's nothing coming out of there, but you'd be surprised over a little bit of time you may look in the bottom of it and see a few drops of water. Now those drops of water over the course of a week or two or a month or something can add up to enough to make that pressure gauge go down and make the boiler stop working. So first port of call, discharge valve. Why is it discharging? It's discharging probably because this expansion vessel has lost its charge. So we do what I said, we take a bit of water out of the system, we top up the expansion vessel with our car foot pump, and then we see how it goes. And very often that will solve the problem. That should really be done on an annual service, but it isn't always done. As I know, people say, oh, it's okay. Sometimes they just push their finger in and hear a little hiss and go, yeah, there's some air in there. We won't worry too much about it. So it's a good place to look. Now, the other reason why that expansion vessel might not be able to do the job that it's intended to do is because this system has got a lot of radiators on it. Now, in this case, all I've done is drawn 2 radiators on it. And as anybody who watches my videos on a regular basis will know, I'm not a great drawer, so I didn't want to push my luck with this, but you could have up to 10 radiators, even 12 radiators on a system. Now, if you think about that, that's a lot more water. And if it's a lot more water and you happen to be heating that water up to somewhere around 80 degrees Celsius or even 70 degrees Celsius, then that's quite a lot of expansion that's going to take place. And when that expansion takes place, you may find that the expansion vessel inside the boiler is just not big enough to accommodate all that expansion in the system. And it gets even worse than that, because if you've got underfloor heating on your system, and if you've got pipes snaking up and down under your floors, then you can start to overwhelm that expansion vessel. Now the good news is when you've got underfloor heating, generally you're running that underfloor heating at a lower temperature. So if it's running at something like 45 degrees Celsius, then that's absolutely fine. You will find that it doesn't expand too much. So the very simple solution to that is that what we do is somewhere on the system round about here, put a little pipe in there, and we go up here and we put another expansion vessel, and this time we're going to put a nice big one. You may have seen one of these on the wall. Expansion vessel, pipe coming out of it, and inside there you've got exactly the same situation as you've got there. You've got yourself a little diaphragm in there, you've got a valve on the top, you pump that up, it pushes the diaphragm down. Again, you still need to empty a bit of water out of the system. When you do that, make sure that that pressure vessel is charged up as it should, 1 bar, 1.5 bar, whatever, and then that will accommodate the extra expansion that's taking place in your system. And it's quite a nice thing to do, putting an extra expansion vessel on the system. And another reason people do it is sometimes you find that the membrane gives up inside the expansion vessel, and rather than going and buying a very expensive one that goes into the boiler, that fits in the boiler, you can go and buy yourself a slightly cheaper one that just sits on the wall. If you've got room for it in the airing cupboard or something like that, absolutely no harm. You don't need to fix that one. You can leave that one, just isolate that one, or just leave it, and you can just operate on this expansion vessel instead. So long as you've got an expansion vessel, it doesn't really matter. So that's one scenario that you may think about, that your expansion vessel isn't coping, or that it's letting by, and that it's discharging out there. So if you look and your expansion vessel is fine, if it's pressured up and it's fine and it's keeping its pressure, it's not losing it after a few weeks or a few months, then the other place you can look is the actual pressure relief valve itself. And it may well be that in the little rubber bit of washer that's underneath it, that it's kind of got a bit of debris in there and it's just dripping gently out of there, and that sometimes it's just opening it up, flushing a bit of water through it will do the job. Sometimes it just needs to be replaced. It's a very easy job for a gas safe engineer to do, to just come along and in a few minutes you can just swap that one over, have the system. If it's got isolated valves on the boiler, it doesn't even need to drain the system down. It can just isolate the boiler, take the pressure relief valve off, fit a new one, and you're ready to go. Now, if that isn't the case, if our system isn't losing any pressure through the pressure relief valve, we have a look at the boiler. Proviso that you've got to be gas safe, but we just look at this because there's a lot of engineers who come out who fail to analyse this problem, fail to solve the problem, come along, just have a quick look around, say, oh, you must have a leak somewhere. The only way we can find it, we're going to start hacking up your floors. So they haven't even really done the job of looking inside the boiler. So inside the boiler, we've got our heat exchanger here. We've got our gas there, and the water is coming up into the heat exchanger. It's going round inside the heat exchanger. It's being heated up, and it's coming out hot, and it's going to our system. Now inside that boiler there are a lot of connections, and you may think that if it's leaking inside that boiler you would see some evidence of it leaking. So when he or she takes the cover off and has a look inside, they will be looking for any kind of nasty stains, any kind of green staining, you know, verdigris building up around that, anywhere that it looks like there might be a leaking connection on a pipe. Maybe down by where the pump is, the pump's here, and there may be a little connection down there. There may be a connection here, which is just leaking a tiny little bit of water, which isn't being noticed. And one of the reasons you may not notice it is because we have this fan flue. So there's a fan inside that boiler, and that fan is basically sucking air into the boiler there. It's going down there, it's going into the combustion chamber, and it's being not that hot because it's a condensing boiler, but it's being blown out through the middle of the flue. So if there is any kind of build-up of moisture inside that boiler, it's very likely that it's being evaporated out and blown away before you're getting any indication of it. Now on top of the boiler, very often you will find what they call an auto air vent. And the reason you've got that is you've got water coming up here and water going down there, but it can get trapped in the top of the boiler. And if you had air trapped in the top of the boiler, obviously it wouldn't be working at its full capacity. It'd be getting too hot. You wouldn't be getting the circulation around it, and it would cut out on the thermal cutout. So that little auto air vent there, it has got a float inside it. When the water level comes up inside the thing, it will float that float up to the top, and it will seal that off, and you won't get any more water coming out. Now when air comes, air is lighter than water, so the air will bubble up to the top, and in an ideal world that float will drop slightly and the air will escape out of the boiler. So that's again a fully automatic system, but what we do find that these things are notorious for leaking, and because they're leaking a tiny little bit at a time, you'll find that that's all being blown away by the vigorous circulation of air inside the boiler, and you never see it. And the only reason you'll see it, you might see all the green staining around the valve where you can see that it's been discharging, but other than that you won't know about it. Now they also have a little cap on them, and really speaking that cap should be closed off so that that float isn't operating up and down all the time. Because of this problem of them losing pressure, we tend to get the system running, we tend to run all the air out of the system, and that can take a few days, by the way, because when you introduce fresh water into a central heating system, there's free oxygen in that water, which has got to be kind of boiled out, beaten out by the vigorous action of the pump and the heat and everything else, and it's bubbling away, and after a few days you will find that the free air inside the system is mostly gone. You'll still be getting a bit of it collecting in the tops of your radiators. Now again, if you've got radiators and you're finding that you're having to bleed them a lot, it's because there is air collecting at the top of the radiators. Again, because the air's lighter than the water, the air is collecting at the top of the radiators, and you have to bleed it out. So as you do that, in an ideal world, if it's not coming in from anywhere, that should, after a couple of days, solve itself, and you shouldn't be getting lots of air coming into the system. If you are getting lots of air coming into the system, it's either because you've got micro leaks which are pulling air in, and the micro leaks can be happening from around the radiator valves, and again, because they're small and because these are hot, you may not notice that you've got a tiny little bit of air which is being sucked in around the radiator valves and appearing up here. But the other reason that you get that build up there is corrosion in the system, and that is just basically hydrogen that's collecting. It's a product of the corrosion. The hydrogen gas is collecting in the top of the radiator there, and we have a lot of plumbers will do this, just relieve the valve slightly, put a match or a cigarette lighter to it, and you can see a little flame coming out where the hydrogen is being burnt off. I'm not suggesting you do that, but it is a fact that it can do that. So if it's hydrogen that's coming out of there, because your radiators, your tail rail, whatever else it is rusting away. And you very often find that the air collects in one radiator particularly, or that free hydrogen gas collects in one radiator particularly. That's usually a radiator that's first on the system at the top of the system. So a bathroom tail rail would be a very likely candidate for that to happen. So we've looked at pressure loss due to expansion vessels, due to a pressure relief valve leaking, and then we're looking at corrosion in the system, and we're looking at small micro leaks around the system, which can sometimes be very, very difficult to find. Now, we have got a video on Skill Builder which describes a method that I've used for years of putting something nice and smelly, like a bit of cheap perfume, inside the central heating system, feeding it in so that you can just run that round and go around having a little sniff. And I have found, although people laugh at this and go, what a load of nonsense. I've had people say, plumbers say to me, you're an idiot, you never do that. And I've got to tell you, it works. I've done it on a lot of occasions, and it's very, very effective indeed. You may have to leave it for a few days. You may have to ask the customers to have a sniff about. But one way or another, very often, if there's a small leak somewhere, maybe a leak under the floor or somewhere like that, you will find it. Now, when you're looking for leaks, it's a good idea to isolate the boiler. There's a isolating valve on the flow and the return on the boiler, and just pump the system up and just see if you get a pressure loss on the system. You won't be able to see the pressure loss on the gauge on the boiler because you've sealed that off, but if you've got a gauge on your pressure testing kit, then you just put a little bit of pressure on the system, and if you see the needle go down, you will know that there's some kind of leak on the system itself, and then you have to start investigating, as I say, sniffing about in my case, or lifting up floorboards and hacking up tiles in other people's cases. Now, if this doesn't work, there are specialist companies who will put a leak detection gas into your system, and they go around with a detector and they can find where that gas is escaping, and they can even find that it will come up such a fine molecule that it will come up even through quarry tiles and things like that, and a lot of the time they will be able to find those leaks. Although we have a story which will appear on Skill Builder soon, which will describe a situation where somebody was plagued with a leak. The pressure was dropping within 2 hours of him filling up dramatically all the way to zero, and the leak detection people came round and they couldn't find the leak. That's where the nose comes in. That's not a cheap service to have done. And as Sherlock Holmes said, once you've eliminated all the possibilities, whatever is left, however improbable, is your answer. So here's another reason why you might get pressure loss in a boiler. It's less likely to happen, but it still can happen, even though I did hear from a customer the other day who said she got a heating engineer out and they said this will never happen, and that is a leaking heat exchanger. Now, in this case, the customer got in touch with a boiler manufacturer and they replaced the heat exchanger under the 10-year warranty. So she was very lucky there. But a lot of the time, if you get a failed heat exchanger, the boiler manufacturer will come around, look at the condition of the water, check one thing, that you've got a corrosion inhibitor in the water inside the boiler, and they can tell, even if you've drained it out and you've had one previously or haven't had one, they can tell by looking at it. And also they want to check that you've got a mag filter on there these days, which means that it's cleaning the water as it goes back into the boiler, so that it's not getting clogged up, because all these things, are overheating, hot spots on the heat exchanger can lead to a failure. So we've got a heat exchanger in here, and these days, because we've got high efficiency boilers, this is a very tight knit affair, and we're forcing the products of combustion through that heat exchanger. So we've got a flame under here and we're burning the gas, and the gas is going through here, and it's being forced for a very fine sort of honeycomb matrix, if you like, and it's being taken out through the flue by a fan. So this fan's very high efficiency. The air is coming in on the outside duct of the fan, and it's going around here, and it's being forced up, and it's being drawn up and blown out the middle of the fan. And you will often see on a coldish day the flue gases that's pluming. You get that steam coming out the end of the boiler, and that is basically just the flue gases have been cooled to such an extent that it's condensing immediately. It hits the cold air outside. That's a very good thing. If you see condensate coming out of a flue, that is a good thing. It means your boiler is working hard, it's working efficiently, so don't worry about that. So what can happen in this situation is that the condensate, which drops down here, it doesn't fall onto the burner. It's taken away by a kind of catchment tray, if you like, under here. There's like a trough, if you like, that's under here, and it's got a pipe in it, and then there's a bottle there, and then there's a condensate drain that comes out. Now, at one time you may have seen this, it may have been dripping outside, it may even have frozen on you, but now you won't see it. But if you have a leaking heat exchanger, that condensate that you've got coming out of here will be mixed with a little bit of water. Now, we may be talking about a cupful of water every day, every couple of days. It may be even less than that, but there will be some water leaking out of that heat exchanger and going down into that condensate drain. And again, this is one of these things where you test that bit of condensate, and if you've got something smelly or you've got some corrosion inhibitor inside the system, you can very often just pick up the smell of it from that condensate. The other place that you will find it is if you go and have a little bit of a sniff around the boiler, because again, if you put something smelly in there, you will be getting a nice aroma. So if you went out on your patio and you smelled eau de cologne or something like that, and you put that in the system, you've been foolish enough or rich enough to put that in the system, you would smell it coming out of the boiler flue. So that's an indication of the fact that you've got a leaking heat exchanger. But the other thing you can do, of course, is you can just cut off the boiler at this point, here and here. They've got isolating valves on the bottom of the boiler, on the flow and the return, and you can pressure this boiler up, get your gauge up to 3 bar, leave it, not turned on, not operating, but just leave that boiler at 3 bar and see if that pressure gauge drops, because that pressure gauge should not drop in any appreciable time unless there's a leak inside the boiler. And we've already talked about small leaks occurring around the pump and other areas, the gas water section, but the other place is the heat exchanger where you can get leaks. So that's a place to look, and it shouldn't be assumed that it's the heat exchanger every time, because sometimes people even needlessly replace a heat exchanger on a boiler. And I have to say that if it does come to the point where your heat exchanger needs replacing and it's out of warranty, or somehow the boiler manufacturer has run away from it because you haven't complied with either having a service annually, which is the only way you keep your warranty, or having your cleaner, you had your filter in there, the mag filter in there, or corrosion inhibitor inside the water that's in the system. If you don't comply, if you don't do those things, then your 10-year warranty or 7-year warranty or whatever it is you've got on your boiler will be null and void. So in that case, you're faced with the prospect of having to shell out for a heat exchanger, you know, pay the full cost of having a new heat exchanger and having it fitted. And I'd say in very many cases, if a boiler's something like 4-5 years old, you're probably better off just biting the bullet and buying yourself a new boiler rather than going down the road of replacing the heat exchanger. But you know, these things vary. You know, if you get a good plumber and he's willing to do it a little cheaply, then it might be worth doing. But generally speaking, the new boiler is probably the easiest and best option in those cases. So one more thing I'd like to cover, which is more or less academic, because it doesn't happen very much, because we've gone on to lovely unvented cylinders and we don't suffer this problem like we used to. Back in the day of a copper cylinder, if you've got the old copper cylinder in your airing cupboard with a lagging jacket on or foam around it or whatever you've got inside it. Now inside that cylinder is a coil. So you've got a coil going through the cylinder. That coil in the old days would be made of copper, now it's made of stainless steel. So that's going into your boiler. You've got a flow and you've got a return. So the return's going there. And the flow is probably going in there and back it goes through the boiler. So you've got a circulation going on inside the boiler. Doesn't really matter which way round this coil operates actually, but this is what you've got. Even when you've got an unvented cylinder, the only thing about an unvented cylinder, it looks slightly different sort of shape, but it's still got this basic coil business in here. Now, when you didn't have an unvented cylinder, when you just had an ordinary cylinder like copper cylinder, and you had a tank in the loft and it pushes the cold in the cylinder there, and then the hot comes out, it used to go up to a vent pipe there, and then it would go off to your taps there. So your cold water coming in here, it would be heated up by the heat exchanger. The coil that's inside the cylinder would heat the water up, and the water would rise to the top. The hot water will always rise to the top. The cold water is coming in the bottom, so you get a stratification there, and you've got hot water coming out the cylinder. The variation on that is that instead of having this tank in the loft, a mains fed unvented cylinder is working straight off the mains. So we don't have that. We still have a pipe coming out the top. Instead of having that feed tank up there, we just have the mains coming in there. When you had that feed expansion tank feeding your boiler, if this copper pipe inside the cylinder started to leak through corrosion, through a bit of limescale building up on it, it's called, the cylinder is what we used to call going open. It becomes an open cylinder. Then what happened is that the water in the central heating system, then the pressure would be enough to overcome the coil and leak. And you would find, if you had it on a system like this, you would find that the water was rising in that tank, even though you turned off the ball valve, maybe isolated the ball valve. The customer would say, I can't understand it. I've turned the water off, I've replaced the ball valve, I've done everything, and I'm still getting drip, drip, drip out of my overflow pipe onto the patio at night time. And the reason is that this system here was pressuring this system. So if you've got a differential, let's forget that this was what I just said to you, which was a sealed system. If this is an open vented system like this, and you've got a difference in height between the two tanks, then this water in this tank being higher would be dropping. It would be transferring through the cylinder there, through the coil, through the leaking coil, up into there and raising the water level there. You can actually have it the other way around. If you had this tank higher than that tank, you would get the system working the other way, which would mean that it was putting water into your central heating system rather than out. So this is something we used to get reasonably often. You know, I've probably done about 5 or 6 of these in my plumbing career. And also I had a cylinder which from day one when I fitted it was open. In other words, there was a leak in the coil there, and from the very first day I fitted it, I knew because I filled the cylinder up first and then I found there was water coming out of the central heating system, even though I hadn't filled the central heating system up. So these things do happen. That would probably be the rarest occurrence that I would see these days, because unvented cylinders tend not to leak in any appreciable time internally, but it does happen. And if all else fails, that's something you need to look at. It wouldn't happen with a combi boiler. With a combi boiler, you've got a heat exchanger. You've got this, basically. This whole thing is inside the combi boiler in what we call a plate heat exchanger, which has basically got the cold water coming in from the mains, and it's being heated because you've got water running around a system like that back up into the heat exchanger. So again, you've got a situation where you could have a plate heat exchanger leaking, and that would be causing an issue because you would have mains water pressure coming into the boiler, leaking through the plate heat exchanger, finding its way into the central heating system, or just simply dripping down there. You could also have water from the heating system leaking into the plate heat exchanger and then dripping out. So any of those things can happen and do happen. So a plate heat exchanger could be a reason why you've got a pressure loss from your heating system. And if it is leaking, you generally would see it. You would see some external evidence of it leaking, but not always. Sometimes they leak within themselves. So all these things can be tested, and in time all these things should be tested. But phantom leaks in central heating systems, pressure loss in central heating systems is a very, very common occurrence, and it's something that should never be ignored. I'm Roger Bisbee. I hope you found that interesting and useful. Sorry if it kind of rambled, if you lost you slightly at the end, but I thought I would cover as many bases as I could. Now, if you're a plumber, if you're an installer out there, and you may be able to think of another reason why we get the pressure loss on central heating systems, then put your comments below, and that'll be useful for everybody as well, because, you know, I can't think of everything. I can only speak from experience, really.